Madame Bovary. What if Emma believed the perfect life she saw online? Chapter 1. Emma grew up in a town small enough that its single stoplight was considered a landmark, on a road that most people took only to get somewhere else. Her father raised her plainly and without much imagination. He was a man who believed that a life consisted of work, weather, and the slow accumulation of small, sensible things. And so Emma went looking for imagination elsewhere, and she found it, as girls of her generation found everything, on a small bright screen held 6 inches from her face in the dark of her bedroom, long after the house had gone quiet, and the only light for miles was the one she held in her own 2 hands. She was not a foolish girl. This is the first thing that has to be said, and said plainly, because the easy version of her story calls her foolish, vain, shallow, a cautionary tale, and the easy version is a lie, the same lie that gets told about anyone who dared to want more than they were handed. Emma was intelligent. She read quickly and remembered what she read. Her teachers had called her bright and meant it. She was curious about the world in a way that her town had no use for, and she was full, from a very early age, of a hunger she had no name for and no way to feed. And into that nameless hunger, night after night, poured 1,000 images a day of a life that was always, always somewhere else. Kitchens with marble islands and morning light falling across them like a blessing. Couples on the decks of white boats, heads thrown back, laughing at something just out of the frame, always just out of the frame, so that you could supply the joke yourself, so that the joke was your own longing. A woman Emma's own age in a white dress on a balcony over a blue sea, one bare foot tucked behind the other, a glass of something gold catching the light in her hand, and beneath it a single word, finally living. Emma looked at these the way girls in an earlier century had looked at the hand-tinted plates in romance novels, the swooning heroines and the castles and the men on horseback, and she drew from them the exact same conclusion those earlier girls had drawn across 200 years and every change of technology, unchanged. That this, the light, the sea, the gold in the glass, the laugh aimed at something wonderful just out of frame, this was the real life, the true one. The one that was owed to her by right of having been born and shown it, and that her own life, the stoplight and the flat fields and the road that went elsewhere, was a mistake, a clerical error, a waiting room in which she had been told to sit while, everywhere else, the actual living was being done by everyone but her. What no one told Emma, what the screen was designed, at the deepest level of its engineering, never to tell her, was that the woman on the balcony was also, at that very moment, in her own dark bedroom somewhere on the other side of the world, holding a screen 6 inches from her own face, looking at someone else's balcony, feeling the same nameless hunger, composing the same weightless caption. The whole vast machine ran on precisely this and could not have run for a single hour without it, everyone performing the life that everyone else was envying, and no one, not one single person in the entire glittering chain, actually standing in the place the pictures seemed to come from, because the pictures did not come from a place. That was the secret at the bottom of everything, the secret Emma would pay her whole life to learn. The pictures came from other pictures. The balcony was rented by the hour. The gold in the glass was cold tea, lit well. The laugh aimed just out of frame was aimed at a phone on a tripod held by a bored assistant who had said, for the 9th time, okay, now laugh like he just said something. It was mirrors reflecting mirrors down a hallway with no room at the end of it. But Emma did not know this. Emma believed the pictures were dispatches, honest reports, filed daily, from a country that genuinely existed, a country she had simply not yet found the road to. And so she spent her girlhood the way a prisoner spends it, studying maps of the outside, memorizing the geography of a freedom she was certain was real, rehearsing the life she would live once she finally got out. She curated her own small feed with the seriousness of a scholar. She learned which light was flattering and which was cruel. She learned that a plain meal, photographed from directly above on the one clean corner of the counter, could be made to look like abundance, and that this was not lying exactly. Everyone did it. It was simply the language. It was how you spoke. And in learning to speak it, she took the first step, without knowing it was a step onto the long road that would end where it ended. Because the thing about learning to make your life look like the pictures is that you begin, slowly, to measure your actual life against the version you have learned to produce. And the actual one always loses, because the actual one has dishes in the sink behind the frame, and a father asking what she was doing up so late, and a whole ordinary reality that no angle can crop out when you are the one living inside it. When Charles came along, he seemed, for one short season, like the road out. He was not. He was the opposite of the road out. He was the place itself, the ordinary decent place, arrived in human form to love her. But Emma could not have known that then, and even if someone had told her, she would not have believed it, because Charles arrived at exactly the moment in a young woman's life when the pressure to begin the real story becomes unbearable, when the feed fills up with weddings and rings held toward the light and captions that say he's the one and forever starts now. And Emma, watching girl after girl she had gone to school with cross over into what looked like the beginning of the promised life, felt herself being left behind in the waiting room, and Charles was there, and Charles was kind, and Charles looked at her as though she were already the woman on the balcony. And for a girl starved of exactly that look, a man who gives it freely can be mistaken, easily, fatally, for the answer to a question she had not yet learned to ask correctly. I will tell you about Charles, because in the whole of Emma's story, he is the only person who never once pretended to be anything other than what he was. And this is precisely why the story treats him so cruelly, because the story, having been written by Emma's own eyes, could not register the worth of anything that did not glitter, and Charles did not glitter. Charles gave off no light at all. He gave off warmth, which is different and which does not photograph. He worked with his hands. He was a physical therapist in a town 2 exits up from Emma's, the man you were sent to when your back gave out or your shoulder froze, or you came home from the kind of job that slowly breaks a body. And he was good at it, patient and unhurried, with large, careful hands, and a way of explaining what had gone wrong inside you that made you feel, for the length of the appointment, that you were in the care of someone who would not let go of you carelessly. He had been married once before, briefly and unhappily, to a woman some years older who had worn him down and then left, and he had emerged from it not bitter. He did not have the equipment for bitterness, but quieter, more grateful, the way people are when they have learned that happiness is not guaranteed, and then, against the odds, are handed a second chance at it. When he met Emma, he could not believe his luck, and he never stopped not believing it, right up to the terrible end and past it. She was beautiful in a way that made him shy. She was quick, and she talked about places he had never once thought to think about, cities, seas. The names of colors he did not know were colors. And he mistook her hunger for brightness, which, to be fair to him, is a very natural mistake, because from the outside the two look identical, and the difference between them, the difference between a person who is lit from within and a person who is starving for light, is a difference you often cannot see until you have married it and lived inside it and watched it turn, over 1,000 ordinary evenings, from the thing you fell in love with into the thing that will end you. He loved her with the plain, total, undramatic love of a man who does not know how to perform love and therefore has only the real kind, the kind that shows up and stays and asks little, and is almost completely invisible when set beside a screen full of couples laughing on the decks of boats. That was the tragedy waiting inside their marriage from the first day, folded up small and patient. That Charles's love was real and therefore quiet, and Emma had been trained since childhood to recognize love only in its loud, performed, photographable forms, and so she lived for years beside the genuine article and experienced it as an absence, as a lack, as proof that she had settled, because it did not announce itself, because it did not glitter, because no one, looking at Charles asleep in content in his chair, would ever have captioned it finally living. They married, and here I must be fair to Emma too, because for a few months she was genuinely happy, or close enough to it that the difference did not yet matter, and the reason is worth understanding, because it explains everything that came after. A wedding is the one event in an ordinary life that actually resembles the pictures. For one day, the feed and the life are the same thing. The dress is real and the light is real and the flowers are real. And when Emma posted the photographs, she was not performing a happiness she did not feel. She felt it, fully, and the small hearts that people she barely knew tapped onto her joy fell like warm rain. And she was, for that day and the glow of the days just after it, the woman on the balcony at last. She had crossed over. She had begun the real story. But a wedding lasts a day, and a marriage lasts the rest of your life. And when the pictures stopped, when the last of the wedding glow was liked and archived and slid down out of the feed to make room for the next girl crossing over, the life underneath the pictures turned out to be simply Charles. Charles, coming home in the evening smelling faintly of the clinic, of other people's pain and the ointments that ease it. Charles, wanting nothing in the world more than to sit beside her at the end of the day, content at peace, in a way that Emma found to her own horror unbearable because his contentment was a mirror held up to her, and in it she was supposed to see her own and she did not have any, and rather than admit that the lack might be in herself, she concluded the way we all conclude that the lack must be in the life. In Charles. In the small, clean, sufficient house. In the town with the stoplight. The real life, she was certain, was still out there. This was still the waiting room. She had married the waiting room and called it forever. So she went back to the screen, not less now, but more, far more, because this is the part that people who have never felt it cannot understand. The cure she reached for was the disease. The unhappier her ordinary evenings made her, the deeper she fled into the bright ones held 6 inches from her face, and the brighter those bright ones burned by comparison, and the dimmer poor Charles grew in their glare, and the wider the crack in the floor opened, night after night, until the screen was no longer an escape from her life but a running, glowing, nightly indictment of it. A slideshow, updated hourly, of every single thing she was failing to have. She scrolled through the marble kitchens and then looked up at her own, which was clean, which was fine, which was entirely sufficient for a human life and entirely, cruelly insufficient for the life she had been promised in the dark of her girlhood. She watched the couples laughing on the boats and then looked over at Charles asleep in his chair, his careful hand slack in his lap, and she did not think there is a good man who loves me, and I am safe, and this is enough. She thought and she hated herself a little for thinking it, which only made it worse. This is not the life. This is the waiting room. The real one is still out there, being lived by everyone but me, and it is passing, and I am here, and every day I stay here is a day of it gone forever. And then into exactly this, into a marriage 6 months old and already hollowed out from the inside by comparison, the invitation came. It came from a woman Emma had followed for years, one of the balcony women, someone whose life was lit in precisely the gold and effortless way that Emma had studied since she was 15, the way other people study for exams. There was to be a party, a real one in the real world, in a house Emma had seen only in photographs, and through a long, thin chain of small connections that Emma had cultivated over years for no reason she could have named except this exact possibility, an invitation reached her. One night, one single night inside the pictures, not looking at them through glass but standing in them, breathing the same air, holding the same gold glass in her own hand. Charles did not especially want to go. It was far. It was expensive in a way a knight had no business being. It was not their world, and he had the quiet good sense to know it was not their world, and some animal part of him, the part that loves plainly and therefore sees clearly, may even have felt the first cold draft of what saying yes would let into their lives. But he saw Emma's face when she read the invitation. He saw it light up all at once, the way it had not lit up for him in longer than he wanted to admit, and he loved her in the quiet, invisible way that asks little and gives everything. And so he did the kind thing, the loving thing, the thing that any decent man who wanted to see his wife happy would have done. He said yes. He said, of course, we'll go. He did not know that he had just agreed to the beginning of the end of everything. Neither did she. And that is how these things always begin, not with a catastrophe, not with a clear and refusable temptation, but with a kindness, with a good man wanting to see his wife smile, saying yes to a party. Chapter 2. The house was everything the pictures had promised, and this was the first cruelty of the evening, though Emma would not recognize it as a cruelty until much later, when she understood that a promise kept exactly once is the most expensive thing a person can be given, because it teaches you that the promise was real, and therefore that its absence, every day afterward, is a theft. They drove 2 hours to get there. Charles wore the one good jacket he owned, which was a season or two out of a fashion he had never tracked in the first place, and Emma had spent money they did not comfortably have on a dress. Not a wildly extravagant amount, not yet. That would come later. But the first of the purchases made not for the life she had, but for the life she intended to be photographed inside of. And it is worth marking as the first because every ruin has a first stone, and this was hers. A dress bought not to wear but to appear in. In the car she was quiet, running the evening ahead of time in her mind the way she had run it 100 times since the invitation came. And Charles, misreading the silence as nerves, reached over and put one of his careful hands on her knee and told her she looked beautiful, which she did. And she said thank you without turning her head, because she was already in her mind, somewhere he was not invited. Inside, the party unfolded like a feed made flesh. There was the light, that same gold, forgiving, impossible light, and Emma understood with a small shock that it was not an accident of photography after all, but a thing these people actually paid to have, that they hired others to make their rooms look the way the pictures looked, that the light she had believed was simply how the real life naturally glowed was in fact a service, a line item, and instead of disillusioning her, this thrilled her, because it meant the glow could be bought, and if it could be bought, then it could someday somehow be hers. There were the people, moving through the rooms with the particular ease of those who have never once had to ask what something costs, laughing the laugh she had studied, aimed just out of frame at wonderful things, except here she could turn and see what the laugh was aimed at, and it was aimed at nothing, at each other, at the pleasant nothing of people who have everything. And Emma drank it in as though it were water and she had crossed a desert to reach it, which, in a way she could not have explained, she had. She was good at the party. This is a thing the easy version of her story leaves out, that Emma, dropped at last into the world she had studied from afar, was not out of place, did not embarrass herself, did not reveal the stoplight town in her manners or her speech. She had been rehearsing for this her whole life. She knew the language. She knew how to hold the gold glass and how to laugh the laugh and how to make the small, weightless conversation that these evenings ran on. And for a few hours she passed completely. She was one of them, and it was the happiest she had ever been in her life. And it ruined her, because happiness that intense, experienced once, becomes the new floor beneath which everything ordinary is now, permanently a fall. Charles did not pass. Charles stood near the walls with a drink he did not want, kind and solid and utterly out of place. And twice Emma looked across the golden room and saw her husband, and felt not tenderness but a hot flush of something close to shame at him, at his out-of-season jacket, at the careful, patient decency of him that had no market value in this room. And then, chasing the shame, a worse thing. Shame at herself for feeling it, which she resolved, as she resolved all uncomfortable things, by turning back into the party and pretending, successfully, that she had not seen him at all. She would remember that later. Of all the things she did, that small turning away in the golden room, choosing the party over the sight of her own husband standing lonely against the wall for her sake, would come back to her at the end, as the moment the real betrayal began, long before any of the other ones, the ones that had names. She danced. She talked to people whose lives she had watched through glass for years, and found that up close they were exactly as luminous and exactly as empty as the pictures, though she registered only the luminous part, filing the emptiness away unexamined for a reckoning years off. And near the end of the night she was introduced, in passing, to a man named Rodolphe, though it would be a long time before he mattered. And I mention him here only because Emma would later trace everything back to this night. And he was on it, at the edge of it, the way the first symptom is present at the edge of the illness before anyone thinks to call it one. He was handsome in the practiced way of men who have made their looks into a working instrument. He said something to Emma that was not especially clever but was delivered as though it were, and he let his attention rest on her a beat longer than the moment required. And Emma, starved for exactly that beat, carried it home with her like an ember cupped in both hands. Because that was the thing she carried home, not a memory of a nice party, an ember. The evening had not satisfied the hunger. She understood this on the long drive back in the dark, with Charles humming tunelessly and contentedly beside her, happy simply to have made her happy, happy in a way that now enraged her. The evening had done the opposite of satisfy. It had proven the country existed. For years the balcony life had been an article of faith, believed but never confirmed, and a faith can be lived with. A faith leaves room for doubt, and doubt leaves room for peace. But now she had been there. She had stood inside the pictures and breathed their gold air and passed as one of the blessed, and so the balcony life was no longer a faith. It was a fact. It was real, it was out there. It was continuing at this very moment without her, and she was being driven at 60 miles an hour in the wrong direction, away from it, back toward the stoplight and the clean, sufficient house and the good man humming beside her, and every mile was a small death. "Wasn't that something?" Charles said, meaning the party, meaning it kindly, meaning let us share this, and Emma said yes, it was something, and turned her face to the black window. And in the glass she could see, faintly, the reflection of her own face lit by nothing, and beyond it the dark fields going by. And she began, silently, so that Charles would not hear, to cry, not from sadness exactly, but from a grief with no proper object. The grief of a person mourning a life that was not hers, and had never been hers, and that she had now, fatally, touched. When she got home, she did not sleep. She lay in the dark and did the thing she always did, the only thing that had ever eased her, which was also the thing that was killing her. She took out the small bright screen and she held it 6 inches from her face, and she looked at the pictures from the party, already posted by the balcony people, the gold rooms and the laughing and the light. And she found, with a lurch of her whole heart, a photograph in which she herself appeared at the edge, half in frame, in the dress she could not afford, holding the gold glass, laughing the laugh, indistinguishable for once from the blessed. And she looked at that picture of herself for a long time in the dark, and she thought, there, that is me. That is the real me, the one that got left behind in the wrong life. That woman in the gold light is who I actually am, and everything else, this bed, this dark room, that man asleep beside me, is the mistake I have to find my way out of. She saved the photograph. She would look at it many times in the months to come, on the bad nights, as a map is looked at by someone planning an escape. It did not once occur to her that the woman in the photograph did not exist, that she had been assembled for a single evening out of a borrowed dress and a rented light and a laugh aimed at nothing, and that in setting out to become her, Emma was not escaping toward a real life at all, but walking, steadily and with great determination and open eyes, into a picture, into a hallway of mirrors with no room at the end of it, away from the only real thing she had ever been given, which was, at that moment, breathing softly beside her in the dark, dreaming, poor man, that he had made her happy. Chapter 3. After the party, the ordinary days became unlivable, and Emma began, without ever deciding to buy her way toward the pictures. It started small, the way it always starts small, so small that no single purchase could have been pointed to as the mistake. A set of sheets in a particular shade of oatmeal linen, because the balcony women slept in sheets like that, and Emma had come to believe, without articulating it, that if she slept in the right sheets she would begin to wake up as the right person. A ceramic vase, hand-thrown, expensive for what it was, that she photographed on the windowsill in the morning light with 3 stems of eucalyptus, she had driven 40 minutes to buy. A coffee maker that cost more than a week of groceries and made coffee that tasted, to be honest, about the same as the old one, but that looked, on the clean corner of the counter, like the coffee maker of a woman who had crossed over. None of these things were bought to be used. They were bought to be seen, first by the small, bright audience of the feed, and then, more importantly, by Emma herself, who needed to walk through her own house and see, in every corner, evidence that she was becoming the woman in the saved photograph, and not the woman who had married the waiting room. Charles noticed the packages and said nothing at first, because he loved her, and because a new vase is not a thing a decent man makes a fuss about. When he did gently ask whether they might slow down a little, just for a month or two, just till things evened out, Emma heard in his reasonable question the whole of everything she despised about her life. The smallness of it, the counting, the way that being married to Charles meant forever being the kind of people who had to ask whether they could afford a vase. And she did not hear what was actually in his voice, which was not reproach but worry. The worry of a man watching the person he loves reach for something that recedes as she reaches. They had their first real fight. It was about the vase, and it was not about the vase at all, and it ended with Emma in tears and Charles apologizing for having brought it up, apologizing, absorbing the blame the way he absorbed everything, and buying her, a few days later, to make peace, a small gold necklace she had mentioned wanting, on a payment plan, because that was the only way they could do it, and Emma wore it in her next photograph, and the small hearts fell like rain, and she felt, for about a day and a half, that she was winning. This is where Leroux comes in, and I want to be careful about Leroux because he is the closest thing this story has to a villain, and it would be easy and false to make him a monster. Leroux was not a monster. Leroux was a system, wearing the light, friendly face that systems wear now. He was not a man in a shop, the way the original of him had been, weighing out credit to a country wife across a wooden counter. He was an app. He was a dozen apps. He was the little option that appeared, warm and reasonable, at the bottom of every screen at the exact moment Emma's want collided with her means. Buy now, pay later. 4 easy payments. You deserve this. Treat yourself. Your cart is waiting. He was the pre-approved limit that arrived by email like a gift, congratulating her, raising the ceiling just as her head touched it, always just as her head touched it. He never once said no. That was his entire genius. The genius of the whole apparatus he stood for, that where Charles said, "Can we afford it?" Leroux said, "Of course you can. And even if you can't right now, you can afford the first small piece of it today, and we'll be friends about the rest." And a person starving for a life, offered the choice between a husband who counts and a system that never says no, will choose the system that never says no every time and call the husband cold for good measure. So the purchases grew. Not recklessly in her own mind. Emma never once felt reckless. She felt at every step that she was making a reasonable investment in becoming herself. A weekend away, photographed exhaustively, the hotel chosen for how its bathtub would frame against the window, paid in 4 easy payments. Clothes that photographed as a life rather than as garments. Small perfect dinners staged on the good plates. Each thing on its own defensible. Each thing on its own. The kind of thing the balcony women had and thought nothing of. And that was the trap precisely, that Emma was not comparing her spending to her income, which was modest, but to their spending, which was unlimited. And against an unlimited standard, no amount is ever enough and no line is ever crossed. Because there is no line. There is only the next thing, glowing, 4 easy payments away, and the small warm voice at the bottom of the screen that never, ever says no. And into a woman spending her way toward a photograph, half hollow with the effort of it, lonelier in her staged perfect house than she had ever been in the plain one, came Rodolphe, no longer at the edge of the frame now, but stepping fully into it. He found her the way men like him always find women like her, online, where she had made herself findable, where the saved photograph of her best evening was pinned to the top of a life she had arranged specifically to be envied, and therefore specifically to be approached by someone who understood that a woman who works that hard to be envied is a woman who is not being seen at home. He was good at this. It was, in a real sense, the only thing he was good at. He did not want Emma, not the way she would come to believe he wanted her. He wanted the pursuit of Emma, the game of her, the pleasant confirmation of his own power that came from taking a beautiful, lonely woman's longing and pointing it, for a while, at himself. But he knew this was his craft, exactly what to say, because he had learned to read the particular hunger that Emma wore openly, and what he said, in 100 small ways over 100 messages, was the one thing she had been waiting her whole life to hear and had never once heard from the good man asleep beside her. You were meant for more than this. Anyone can see it. You are wasted where you are. Charles had never said that. Charles could not have said it because Charles did not believe she was wasted. Charles believed she was home, was loved, was exactly where a happy life was possible if only she could see it. And so the truest and kindest thing about Charles, his belief in the sufficiency of the life they had, arrived in Emma's ear as an insult, as smallness, as a cage, while Rodolphe's flattery, which was a tool, which was the oldest tool there is, arrived as recognition, as rescue, as the voice of the real life finally calling her name. She could not tell them apart. She had never been able to tell them apart. The whole machinery of her life, from the girlhood screen to the golden party to the small warm voice that never said no, had trained her to hear love in its performed and flattering forms, and to hear only reproach in its quiet real one. And Rodolphe was simply the last and most dangerous instrument in a long line of instruments, all of them playing in different registers, the same single note that had been sounding in Emma's ear since she was 15 years old in the dark. The real life is somewhere else. It is not here, it is not this, it is not him. She began to answer Rodolphe's messages late at night, in bed, 6 inches from her face in the blue light, while beside her in the dark, Charles slept the deep, untroubled sleep of a man who did not yet know that the waiting room he was so content to share with her had, some time ago, quietly become a place she was planning to leave. Chapter 4. The affair with Rodolphe was, for a while, everything Emma had been promised. That was its danger. If it had been sordid from the start, if it had felt like a betrayal, she might have surfaced from it. But it felt, at first, exactly like the pictures, like the country existing at last. And a person cannot be warned away from the thing she has spent her whole life believing was the point of living. They met in cities 2 hours in every direction, cities where no one knew her, and in those borrowed afternoons Emma became, for a few hours at a time, the woman in the saved photograph. Rodolphe knew the good hotels, the ones with the light. He knew how to make an ordinary lunch feel like a scene from a life worth envying, because making things feel that way was his single genuine talent, the talent of the men who populate the pictures. And Emma mistook his talent for depth the way she had mistaken every glittering thing for depth since she was 15. She photographed those afternoons too. Not his face, never his face. She was not so far gone as that yet, but the corner of a room, the light on a glass, her own hand on white linen, and she posted them cropped and captioned into the language of the balcony. And the small hearts fell. And no one who tapped them knew that the woman finally living was living on stolen afternoons and borrowed money, and a man who was, even then, growing bored. Because Rodolphe was always going to grow bored. This is the part Emma could not see, and the part that was most inevitable. And it was inevitable for the same reason everything in her life was inevitable. She did not want Rodolphe. She wanted the life she believed Rodolphe was a door into. And he could feel that, the way such men can always feel it. And there is nothing that cools a man like Rodolphe faster than the discovery that a woman is not in love with him, but with what he represents, not because it wounds his heart. He had little enough of that, but because it ends the game. The pleasure for him had been in being wanted. And Emma, it turned out, did not want him. She wanted the balcony, and had simply mistaken him for a season, for the balcony. And once he understood this, once the afternoons began to carry the faint whiff of a woman using him as a set piece in a life she was staging for an audience of strangers, the pursuit was over, because the prey had turned out to be pursuing something behind him, through him, that had never been him at all. She poured more into it as he pulled back, which is the law of these things. She spent more small gifts for him now, on the 4 easy payments, because she had begun to feel him cooling and did not understand that no purchase could warm a man who had only ever been playing a game that was now finished. She made plans, elaborate plans, spoken in the borrowed hotel rooms, plans to leave Charles, to run, to begin the real life together in earnest and out loud and forever. And Rodolphe agreed to all of them, warmly in the moment, because agreeing was easier than the conversation that ended it, and because a man like Rodolphe never says the true no. He lets the woman keep the plan and simply, gradually, stops being reachable, until the plan is a thing she is holding alone in a room he has quietly left. And that is how it ended in the end, not with a scene, with a message that did not come and then another, and then a slow, terrible understanding that spread through Emma over a period of days like cold water finding the low places. The afternoon stopped. The replies came slower, then stopped. And Emma, who had rehearsed the beginning of the real life 1,000 times, discovered that Rodolphe had ended it the way you close an app, not cruelly, not with a slammed door, but with a simple withdrawal of presence, a going dark, which is the modern shape of abandonment and in some ways the cruelest, because there is no scene to grieve, nothing to point to, no wound with edges, only an absence where a person used to be and the slow, humiliating realization that you were, the whole time. A diversion in someone else's ordinary afternoon. She did not tell Charles. Of course she did not tell Charles. Something in her broke that season, quietly, structurally, the way a beam cracks inside a wall long before the ceiling shows it, and Charles saw only that his wife was unwell, that she had taken to her bed, that she wept without saying why, that she pushed away her food and lay for hours with the small bright screen dark on the blanket beside her, not even looking at it now, which frightened him more than anything, because the screen had been the one thing that reliably eased her, and now even it had stopped working. He was tender with her. He brought her things. He sat on the edge of the bed and held one of her hands in both of his careful ones and asked her, over and over, what he could do, and the honest answer which she could never have given him was, "Nothing. You can do nothing. What I want does not exist, and I have spent everything we have, and everything we do not have, trying to reach it, and the man I thought was the door into it has closed like an app, and the life I have, you, this house, this bed, is the only real thing left, and it is the one thing I cannot bear, because it is proof that the pictures were never coming for me." She recovered partly. People do. The body insists. And when she rose from the bed, she found that the second law of her life was waiting for her exactly where she had left it, patient as a system always is: the bills. Because while she had been buried in Rodolphe and then buried in the loss of him, the 4 easy payments had gone right on being due, and the pre-approved limits had gone right on quietly raising themselves, and the small, warm voice that never said no had continued not saying no. And the sum of all the things she had bought to become the woman in the photograph had grown in the dark, while she wasn't looking, into a number. A real number. A number with the weight of a real thing. The first genuinely real thing to enter her life in years. And it had been accumulating the whole time beneath the pictures, the way the truth always accumulates beneath the pictures. And it was very large, and it was hers, and it was coming due. And it was into this. A woman hollowed out by the end of a fantasy, sitting at her kitchen table in front of a stack of statements she had been ignoring for months, in a house full of beautiful things she had bought to be seen holding, that the second man came. Leon. Young and dreaming, and full of the same hunger she'd had at his age, looking at her the way she had once looked at the balcony women, mistaking her staged life for the real one, mistaking her for someone who had crossed over. And Emma, drowning, reached for him the way a drowning person reaches for anything at all. Not because she believed anymore, she was past belief now, but because being adored, even by a boy who adored a picture of her, was the only anesthetic she had left against the number on the table and the silence where Rodolphe had been, and the unbearable, patient, loving presence of the good man who would not stop asking what he could do. Chapter 5. Leon was not a bad boy. None of them were bad. That was the terrible arithmetic of Emma's life. She was surrounded, from first to last, by people who were not bad, and she went down among them anyway, and there was no one to blame at the end, which is the hardest kind of ruin to survive, the kind with no villain in it. He was young, younger than her by enough that it mattered, and he worked some junior job in one of the cities where she used to meet Rodolphe, and he had found her the same way Rodolphe had, through the pictures, except that where Rodolphe had seen Prey, Leon saw a vision. He genuinely believed in the woman in the photographs. He believed Emma was what she had spent years arranging to appear to be, a woman who had crossed over, who lived in the gold light, who knew the secret of the real life and might, if he was worthy, share it with him. He looked at her exactly the way she had once looked at the balcony women, with the whole of his unguarded hunger showing on his face. And Emma, who had spent her life on the wanting side of that look, discovered that being on the receiving side of it was the closest thing to the balcony she had left. If she could not be the woman in the photograph, she could at least be believed to be her, by someone whose belief was total, and for a while that was almost enough. But only for a while, and the reason cut deeper than Rodolphe ever had. Because with Rodolphe, Emma had been the one gazing up, projecting the real life onto a man who represented it, and being the projector, however doomed, at least kept the dream alive, kept the balcony out there, shimmering possible. With Leon, she was on the other side. She was now the screen someone else projected onto. She was the picture, and a picture knows, as no viewer ever can, exactly how little is behind it. Every time Leon looked at her with that transported, worshipful hunger, "You're everything. You've got it all figured out. I want the life you have." Emma heard the hollowness ring behind her own image like a knock on a door with no room behind it. She knew what was behind the photographs. She was living behind them. Behind them was a stack of statements on a kitchen table and a going dark, where a man used to be and a husband whose careful hands she could no longer bear to be touched by. And here was this boy, adoring the front of all that, wanting to climb inside it. And she wanted to scream at him that there was nothing inside it, that she had spent her whole life and all her money and her one good marriage trying to get inside it herself, and there was nothing there, that the picture was a door painted on a wall. She did not scream it. She let him adore her, and she used his adoration the way you use a drug you no longer even enjoy, for the numbness rather than the pleasure. And she spent more money to keep the affair looking like the life it was supposed to be, more hotels with the right light, more small perfect scenes staged for an audience of two now, him and the feed, and the number on the kitchen table grew and grew, past the point where any amount of not looking could shrink it, past the point where the small warm voice could raise a limit fast enough to outrun it, until the system that had never once said no said, at last, the only word it had been holding back the whole time, and it said it not gently and not warmly but all at once from every direction, in the flat institutional language of consequences. No more. Now pay. The messages changed character. They stopped congratulating her. The warm voice that had said "you deserve this" was replaced by colder voices, by numbers with due dates in red, by the word final, by letters, actual letters on paper, arriving at the house, which was how she knew it was truly ending, because the pictures had never once come on paper and now the truth was coming on paper, heavy, undeniable, addressed to both of them, to Mr. and Mrs. Bovary, because the debt, it turned out, had never been only hers. She had signed things. In the fever of becoming, she had signed things she had not read, put his name beside hers on plans he knew nothing about. And now the reckoning was arriving at the door of the good man who had asked only whether they might slow down, just for a month, just till things evened out, and been called cold for asking. She tried to hide the letters. She had gotten very good over the years at hiding the true version beneath the presented one. It was, when you came down to it, the only skill her whole life had taught her. And for a few weeks she intercepted the mail and forged a calm across her face and staged, even now, even at the very end, small perfect breakfasts that she photographed with shaking hands, as though a well-lit table could hold back what was coming, as though if the picture stayed beautiful, the truth might agree to stay away. It could not. It does not. The last thing to go in a person built the way Emma was built is the belief that the presentation can save you, and she clung to it right up until the morning the notice came that could not be intercepted because it did not come by mail. It came by a knock. Official, unhurried, certain. The house, the staged, beautiful, 4 easy payments house, full of vases bought to be seen and plates bought to be envied, and the oatmeal linen she had believed would make her wake up as someone else. The house and everything in it was to be inventoried and valued and taken, to be sold against the number, which had finally, after all its patient years of growing in the dark, come fully into the light and stood now in the doorway wearing the face of a man with a clipboard, asking politely to be let in. And Charles was home when the knock came. Chapter 6. The man with the clipboard was polite. That was somehow the worst of it, that the end, when it finally came through the door, wore no cruelty at all, only procedure. He explained the process to Charles in a low, even voice while Emma stood in the kitchen doorway, and Charles listened, and Charles did not understand because Charles was hearing, for the first time in a stranger's mouth, the full shape of a thing his wife had been building in the dark for years. The number, the signatures, the plans made in his name that he had never made. Emma watched his face as the man spoke, watched him try to fit the words into the world he thought he lived in and fail, watched the exact moment the words stopped being a mistake to be corrected and became a truth to be survived. And it was the second time in her life she had seen Charles's face do something she could not bear to look at, the first having been at the golden party, against the wall, lonely for her sake. She had turned away then. She could not turn away now. There was nowhere in the small house left to turn. He did not shout at her. She almost wished he would. A cruel man, confronted with what Emma had done, would have raged, and rage would have given her something to push against, a villain to make herself the victim of, a scene with edges. But Charles was not cruel. He had never once in his life been cruel. And so when the man with the clipboard had gone and the two of them stood in the house that was no longer theirs, among the beautiful things that were being counted and taken, Charles did not accuse her. He turned to her with his face wrecked and open, and he asked, in a voice with no anger in it at all, only bewilderment and a terrible enduring tenderness, the one question she had no answer for. Why didn't you tell me? We could have, I would have, why didn't you come to me? And Emma could not say it, because the answer was the whole of her life, and the whole of her life could not be said in a kitchen. The answer was that she had not come to him because coming to him would have meant admitting that the life he offered was the only life there was, that the balcony did not exist, that she had thrown away everything real reaching for a picture, and admitting that was the one thing she could not do, had never been able to do, because if the picture was not real, then her whole self was not real. The woman in the saved photograph was not real. And there was nothing left of Emma but a country girl who had wanted too much and destroyed a good man for a door painted on a wall. She could not say it. She said nothing. And her silence, which he had no way to read, he took, of course, for the last of her secrets, when in fact it was the only true and naked thing she had left in her, too large and too late to speak. She went looking for help, because a person going down will always first go looking for help, and it is in the looking that they learn most precisely how alone they are. She went to Rodolphe. This is the lowest point, and I will not soften it. She humbled herself entirely, she who had staged her whole life to be envied, and she asked the man who had gone dark on her to help her with the number, and Rodolphe, who had money, real money, who could have made the whole thing disappear with a fraction of what he spent on the light in his own rooms. Rodolphe was regretful and warm and utterly immovable, and told her he simply couldn't, times being what they were, though times were nothing to him, and she understood standing there. That his warmth had always been exactly this, a substance with no load-bearing capacity, a light that could not hold weight, and that she had built the whole back half of her life on it. She went to Leon. Leon was frightened. He was young and he had a junior job, and the vision he had adored had turned, overnight, into a woman in real trouble asking a boy for real money. and the picture he had worshipped could not survive the request, because the request was the truth behind the picture arriving at last. And Leon did what people do when the truth behind the picture arrives. He backed away from it. He went dark too, in his softer, guiltier, younger way, but dark is dark. And so she had gone the whole circuit of the life she had chosen over Charles, the man who represented the balcony, the boy who worshipped the balcony, the system that had financed the balcony, and every single one of them, when she turned to them in her actual need, had shown her the same thing, that there had never been anything behind any of it. The balcony people could not hold weight. The systems that never said no now. The adoration evaporated the instant it was asked to become love. Everything she had reached for her entire life, when she finally, in extremity, put her full weight on it, gave way at once, all of it, as though it had been made of light the whole time, which it had, and the only thing in her entire world that did not give way, the only thing that held, that stayed, that bore her full weight without cracking, was the thing she had spent that same entire life despising. The plain, quiet, unglittering love of the good man standing in the emptying house, who had asked why she hadn't come to him, and who, even now, even knowing everything, had not left. But Emma could not go to that. That was the final cruelty of how she was made, the one the whole story had been driving toward. The one real thing was right there, holding, offered, and she could not take it, because taking it meant surrendering the last of the dream, and without the dream she did not know how to be a person at all. She had been the woman reaching toward the balcony for so long that she no longer knew who she was if she stopped reaching, and Charles's love asked her, gently, to stop reaching, to come down, to be nobody special in a small clean life with a man who adored her. And she found, testing it in the wreckage, that she could not, that she would genuinely rather die reaching than live having stopped. And she saw, with a clarity that had come far too late to save her and just in time to damn her, that this had always been true, that it had been true in the golden room when she turned away from him, true in every hotel and every purchase and every caption, and that everything since the party had only been the long working out of a choice she had made the first time she held a bright screen in the dark and believed the pictures were a country. The choice of the painted door over the real room, made once in innocence and never ever taken back. Chapter 7. I will not make her death beautiful, because the whole of her life was the pursuit of making things beautiful that were not, and to give her a beautiful death would be to tell, one last time, the lie that killed her. It was not beautiful. It was the opposite of the pictures. That is the only mercy the truth had left to offer her, and it is a cold one, and I will give it to her honestly, because honesty is the one thing no one ever gave Emma, least of all herself. She did it in the emptying house, in the days when the beautiful things were being carried out one by one, when the walls showed the pale rectangles where the staged life had hung. She did it quietly, without a caption, without an audience, the first genuinely private act of her adult life, and it was ugly and it was slow, and it was nothing at all like the way the heroines went in the stories she had believed since she was 15. There was no soft light. There was no laughing just out of frame. There was only Emma, alone with the truth she had spent everything to avoid, finding out in her own failing body the one fact the pictures had never shown her, which is that the body is real when nothing else is, that it keeps no account of how a life looked and only of what was done to it, and that it does not die gracefully to suit a narrative. She had wanted, her whole life, to be the woman in the photograph. She died as the woman she actually was, which is the fate she had feared above all others, and it found her anyway because it had always been the only real thing about her, waiting patiently underneath. The way the number had waited, the way the truth always waits. Charles found her. Of course Charles found her. Charles, who had been carrying the beautiful things out to the men from the auction, because he did not know what else to do with his hands. Charles, who had not left, who would never have left, who had spent the days since the knock on the door not raging at his ruined life, but trying in his plain, useless, loving way to figure out how to keep her, how to start again, how to build some small, sufficient thing out of the wreckage that she might, this time, finally, agree to live inside. He found her, and he did not understand, and then he understood. And the sound he made was not one I will put on the page, because some things are not for looking at. And Charles, who had been looked away from his whole marriage, had earned at least that to grieve unphotographed, unwitnessed, in a language that no feed has a symbol for. Here is the part the stories never tell, the part after the ending, where the real cost gets paid by the people who never chose any of it. Charles learned everything in the weeks that followed. He found the messages, Rodolphe's and Leon's, the whole hidden architecture of the life she had lived beside him and against him. And a smaller man, a man more like the men she had chosen over him, would have hated her then, would have been freed by the hating, would have rewritten the marriage into a story where he was the wronged party and she the villain, and salvaged his own heart in the editing. Charles could not do it. He read every word of her betrayals, and at the end of them he loved her still, helplessly, completely. The same quiet, unglittering love that had never once been enough for her and was now, absurdly, all that was left of her in the world, a love with no one to land on, going on, like a light left burning in an empty house. He did not last long after her. Men like Charles, it turns out, are not built to outlive the thing they love, even when the thing they love has spent years proving it did not want to be loved. He faded, and then he was gone, and the plain, decent life that Emma had found unbearable turned out to have been the only thing holding two people up, and with her gone, it could not even hold him. And there was a daughter. There is always, in the real accounting, a daughter, some small person who was in the house the whole time, at the edge of the frame, never the subject of the pictures because a real child, tired and ordinary and needing things, does not photograph the way the staged life needs to photograph. She was young enough that she would not remember much. A mother often turned away, holding a bright screen, staging breakfasts she was not allowed to eat until they had been captured. A father with careful, sad hands. When both of them were gone, she was taken in by relatives who had little, and she grew up plainly and worked young and never knew, because no one could bear to tell her, that everything she did not have, the ease, the safety, the small sufficient inheritance a decent man's whole life of careful work should have left her, had been spent, every cent of it and more, on vases bought to be seen, on the right light, on afternoons in cities with good hotels, on the long doomed campaign to become a woman who did not exist, photographed by a woman who could no longer bear the one who did. That is the whole of it. There is no lesson in it that Emma herself did not learn too late in the emptying house, and learning it too late is not the same as being spared, which is the thing the stories get wrong when they hand out wisdom at the end like a prize. Emma understood everything at the last. She saw the painted door for what it was. She saw the real room she had refused. She saw the good man she had thrown away, and the child at the edge of the frame, and the number that had been the only honest thing in her life. And understanding all of it changed nothing, saved no one, because understanding is not a currency that spends backward, and the 4 easy payments had already come due, and been paid in full by everyone except the woman who had signed for them. She had spent her whole life certain that the real life was somewhere else. She was right in the end, in the only way she never wanted to be. It had been somewhere else the entire time. It had been in the small, clean house she couldn't bear, beside the quiet man she couldn't see, at the edge of the frame where the child was. In every ordinary evening she had scrolled straight through on her way to a country that was only ever other people's pictures of a country that was only ever pictures. The real life had been right there, holding still, waiting to be looked at. She looked instead at the light in her hand, 6 inches from her face until the very end. The end,